Well, hey, friends, welcome to AWKNG's Ask a Scholar podcast. This is where you, the everyday Christian, can get your questions about the Bible answered by a biblical scholar. I'm Carla.
And I'm Mike, and we're both glad that you decided to join our discussion. So let's dive in.
Well, welcome everyone to episode 15. We are really excited today to dive into questions on 1 Kings. And with us today, we have Dr. David Lamb. Dr. Lamb, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, we're really glad that you're here with us today and you're going to share lots of wisdom and answer all the questions that have come in from our students. But before we dive into those questions, why don't you take a minute or two and just tell our listeners who you are, some of the areas of study and focus that you've done throughout your career, and just a little bit more about who you are.
Great. Well, happy to be with y'all. I love talking about the Bible. So I've, in my younger days, I was on staff within a varsity, so I did campus ministry for a while. And then I got my MDiv, and then I did my doctorate over in England. My doctorate was on the Book of Kings, so that's relevant.
Yep.
I've written a couple books along the way, including a commentary on the Book of Kings. And then I wrote a couple of popular books, God Behaving Badly, Prostitutes and Polygamists, a look at love Old Testament style, and The Emotions of God, making sense of a God who hates, weeps, and loves. So I love connecting to people. I love talking to people about the Bible, and I'm happy to be here to talk about Kings.
Awesome. Well, we're really glad to have you. And as we wrap up this episode, I'd love for you to hold up some of those books and resources that you mentioned so that our viewers can hopefully engage those, buy those, and dive in deeper, especially in that commentary. That's, I'm sure, going to be a great resource for them to lean on. So, Mike, if you're ready, let's dive straight into some questions. Y'all good with that?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. So Dr. Lamb, the first question that's come in says, and this is kind of a great question, I think, to start on because it's a big overview question. It says, what is the main message of 1st and 2nd Kings, which I know in the next episode, we're going to hit 2nd Kings. They said in their question, is it just mainly an account of history, or is there something else that we should be seeing as we read through these books?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a broad one. Kings is actually, I tell people this, Kings is initially just one book, and Kings is actually the longest book in the Bible. So a lot of people don't know that, but it's hard to encapsulate it into kind of one main message. But if I did, maybe we could say it's a tragedy. It's really, in some ways, a dark book, a sad book, the tragedy of God's people falling into disobedience and idolatry, and the consequences of this tragedy are severe. The book starts out great. Solomon asks God for wisdom, builds the temple, but then he himself falls into apostasy, worshiping other gods. And then the kingdoms get divided and they struggle. God sends prophets, Elijah and Elisha, perhaps the most famous ones, to call Israel and Judah back to himself. But it ends really tragically. And there's all this disobedience and idolatry. And the end of the book talks about Josiah was a great king. We could talk about him more in the next session. But his 4 heirs are all evil. And so I don't know. It's good to learn from other people's mistakes. I had a seminary professor, Bobby Clinton, talked about vicarious learning. Hopefully we learn lessons from our own mistakes. But if possible, it's good to learn from other people's mistakes. And Kings has a lot of other people's mistakes that we can hopefully be learning from, about what it means to be obedient to God and God's word, and what it means to listen to God's prophets. And so those are just a few themes that I saw in the book.
That's good. Mike, any other thoughts on that one?
I think to take into account just from how the book of Kings begins and how it ends, it's an interesting kind of almost feels like there's this, you're starting off with this tension of what's going to happen. David's about to die. There are these other heirs and rivals who will succeed him. And then, we have that fleshed out finally with Solomon, and everything seems hopeful, everything seems great. And then we go through the whole entire reigns of the kingdom breaking into two, and then two different kingdoms, and all the drama that happens with that. And the very end, the book leaves us with it's despairing, but there's a glimmer of hope that the descendants of David would still continue. And so that is an interesting thing of how there was at the beginning, it just starts off with, we just don't know what's going to happen now with David about to die. And then at the end, you're almost asking the same question. We have no idea what's going to happen with the family of David, with this dynasty. What's going to happen to the line of David? And we're left with just this glimmer, this dynasty, the hope of a son of David will still continue because there is a survivor. And so I think it's a book that takes into account a lot of the despair, but at the same time, there are glimpses of hope that you're holding on to as, a person that's hoping for some sort of redemption. And I think at least that's one of the themes that I would see, and that I would, hopefully try to emphasize despite all the crazy that happens throughout the whole narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. And I mean, we see a lot of positive examples of hopeful people. Well, obviously the prophets Elijah and Elisha, and they come in and bring healing and restoration. Both Elijah and Elisha bring children back from the dead. And you see the faithfulness of these prophets, and you do see a variety. I mean, they're kind of the minority of good kings. Solomon certainly starts out great. Actually, Jeroboam the first starts out pretty good too. The king I did my dissertation on, Jehu, starts out pretty good, and for a northern king, he's probably the best. And there's Hezekiah and Josiah. So we get some hopeful messages along the way, hopeful rulers that are actually responding well to the prophets. And I think we do see kind of glimmers of hope. And I think we may talk about the Davidic promise later. But the book is it's a hard one. And there's kind of a lot of ups and downs, but I do see hope. But I think the tone is darker than other books, like Samuel and there's a lot of dark stuff in Samuel about David and David's family, but we see these great hopeful kings, and kind of a series of them in the Davidic line that do kind of leave us some pointers to Jesus. And we could talk about that later, but it's a sobering book. I don't want people to come in kind of thinking this is going to be like, Psalm 23 or something, or, Jeremiah 29:11, these hopeful verses. There's glimmers of hope, without a doubt. But,
and so you would say though, it's more than just a history book, because I know that was part of that person's question. It's much more than that. It's really it sounds like it's a little bit of some warnings about what not to do, and then also some hope, and then that Davidic line seems to be a strong thread.
No, it's good. We could talk about history a lot. In fact, there's a lot of history, arguably more history in Kings than almost any other book. Well, at least in the Old Testament. But there's a lot of connections to ancient Near Eastern rulers. Tiglath-Pileser, Sennacherib, obviously at the end, Nebuchadnezzar. These are some of the names you may have heard of. But so there's a lot of history. But the Old Testament's not primarily concerned about history and recording facts, but revealing history in order to connect people to Israel's God. And it's a theological history. It's a history about God and God's working with his people. So yes, definitely history, but far more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me transition us into our next question because it plays in with some of the stuff that I could tell you wanted to touch on, but you didn't know when the question was coming. So this second question says, how does the Davidic covenant shape the narrative of these books? So why don't you dive straight into that?
Sure. And, I'm sure some people are going to be familiar with the term the Davidic covenant, but just for those who aren't, um, we really need to go back to Samuel, or actually a version of this shows up in Chronicles. I'm working on a commentary on Chronicles right now. But 2 Samuel chapter 7, David's like, okay, I'm finally settled into my kingdom. I've got this really cool house. Hey, God, I'd love to build you a house. And God's
Mm-hmm.
not so excited about this idea. It's like, David, did I ask for a house? I was pretty content with that whole tabernacle tent thing. And, so God almost seems a little offended, but then the David would ask for him to build him a house. It's almost like, David, look, I'm the one in charge. You're not going to be my patron. You're not going to do things for me. I do things for you. You wanted to build me a house. I'm going to make you a house. And when God says this, he says a house in the sense of a dynasty. I'm going to give you an eternal royal dynasty, which is this amazing kind of promise covenant. David, this man after God's own heart, had many opportunities to kill Saul, his predecessor, and doesn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
Writes all these psalms. So the promise, though, to David, you're going to have a son that will reign after you. And that's going to go on, well, ad olam in the Hebrew, often gets translated as forever. But and as that is a theme that carries through the end, all the way through the books of 1 and 2 Kings, because David's descendants continue
Mm-hmm.
to reign, not over Israel, the northern kingdom, after the kingdom is divided, but over Judah. And as we
Mm-hmm.
compare David's dynasty to the other dynasties, and part of my dissertation was on ancient Near Eastern dynasties. David's dynasty is one of the longest in the ancient Near East. And so I was comparing him to Egypt and Assyria and Babylon. David's dynasty lasted 450 years before a Davidic ruler kind of was taken off the throne when Nebuchadnezzar kind of finally came over and conquered the southern kingdom of Judah. But God promised David that his descendants would reign, and they did over Judah. Now, his son, well, actually his grandson, Rehoboam, lost the northern kingdom. So
Mm-hmm.
in 1 Kings, kind of 11 and 12, the kingdoms get divided. But there's this little theme that shows up because David had a lot of evil descendants who are kings.
Yeah. Yeah.
But whenever one of them reigns and does something evil, the text throws in this little note saying that God was going to give them a lamp. There's 3 of these so-called lamp oracles scattered around the book of 1 and 2 Kings. And the lamp is clearly saying that because of David, I'm going to let your descendants, even though they're evil, I'm going to let them continue to reign. Um, and as Mike was saying just a few minutes ago, the book does end on a kind of a dark note, but there's a glimmer of hope because this guy who's 20 generations removed from David, Jehoiachin, gets kind of put back in a position of honor in the Babylonian prison, or he gets to eat at the king's table. And as we jump forward to the book of Matthew, the New Testament begins with this Davidic dynasty, this Davidic family tree that
Mm-hmm.
goes starting back with Abraham and then to David, and then it kind of moves forward all the way to Jesus. And then the gospel writers start out and says, the kingdom of God is at hand. And it's for people who are familiar with this theme of the Davidic promise, what we see here is this promise, which had kind of gone underground after the Babylonian exile, and then during the Persian period, and then the kind of the Dark Age, and then the Greco-Roman period, kind of emerges with Jesus, God's Son, Davidic descendant. And he's often called Son of David in the Gospels, and yet on some level Jesus is David's descendant, and he has come to bring in a new kingdom. And so it all goes back to 2 Samuel 7. This theme of the Davidic promise, the Davidic covenant, kind of carries through the book of Kings and takes us all the way forward to the Gospels and Jesus, the king, the new Davidic king who has arrived on the scene and ushers in his kingdom.
Yeah, I would also say, like, if I can add anything to what you said, Dr. Lamb, is simply that there is, I mean, the composition of Kings is probably was influenced post exile, right? And so there is this, like, we have to do a recounting of what happened through this history and what happened to the family of David. And one of the more interesting scholarly works I had used a few years ago for one of my papers, the author, Brian Verrett, he talks about this messianic motif. And he points out how the books of Joshua, Samuel, and even Kings, there is this hint of this messianic motif. In particular, in Kings, it shows up as every one of the descendants of David. We find out who was their father, they're the son of this guy. But then the author of Kings would also mention as well, this is this person's mother. And it just keeps consistently mentioning about how this descendant of David has this mom. And the proposal is that, in some sense, this is a subtle hint of the promise going back to Genesis 3 of one day there will be the offspring of the woman who would actually crush the head of the serpent. And so the concept is that this subtle hint of even mentioning the mom, which is not a usual practice for genealogical records.
Yeah, I actually found that very strange when I was reading. I was wondering that, so I'm actually glad you're talking about it.
Yeah, so that's his proposal, was that there's a messianic motif that's happening. It's a literary motif, and that it shows up in Kings, and there's this subtle hint. We're longing for the son of David. We're longing for who we think is going to be the serpent head crusher, that the person will be able to fulfill what we really wish David could have been. And anyways, that's just one of the concepts that I kind of kept in mind as I've been reading through Kings, is that there is this interesting, it's like, why is the mom so important? And as you mentioned, Dr. Lamb, that even in the Gospel of Matthew, in his genealogical lists, he mentions 4 moms. He mentions 4 women within the list. As though this is important. That it's not just we're including women into the genealogical record, but there is a theological reasoning as well that's behind all this.
Yeah. I mean, that's fascinating. I'd love to read the article. And as you say, and I've done a lot of work with ancient genealogies. Most of them are pretty boring, to be quite honest. I'm writing a commentary on Chronicles, and the first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles are all genealogy. There's actually wonderful stuff in genealogies, as Mike had said, and Carl had kind of pointed out as well in terms of Kings, that we do have to ask, what are these women doing there? And it's more sort of noticeable in Matthew's gospel, just because the women that get mentioned, are arguably all have sort of kind of maybe a dubious background, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and then it doesn't even say Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah. Solomon's mom is the wife of this other guy. So there's kind of a little bit of a scandal right there. I haven't thought about that. there are no moms mentioned for the northern kingdom. It's just the southern kingdom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I haven't encountered that theory before, so I have to think about it a little more. It is interesting. It's fascinating to think about. Maybe there are some kind of pointers back to Genesis 3. Some people call curse, or the consequences of Genesis 3 on the woman that her descendant will bruise the head of the serpent's descendant. It's a hard one, though, because even the New Testament authors aren't sure what to do with that. What is sometimes called the proto-evangelium from Genesis 3. So I probably need to be a little tentative. It's fascinating to think about that. And it is wonderful to realize, okay, only on the Judah side, only on the descendants of David, do we see these women. And they do feature prominently in a kind of a shocking way about Jesus's family tree in Matthew 1. But I need to think more about that. That's really interesting, Mike.
I'll send you a link to the book. It was an immensely helpful resource.
Great.
Good. Well, maybe our students will get encouraged to dig into that too and do some research on their own. I'm going to jump us to the next question, and we'll hit this one and then we'll hit a commercial break. But I want to kind of bring us towards the beginning of First Kings. And this question is regarding the temple, which we know in the beginning, Solomon is building the temple. And so their question says in First Kings 7, when the author is describing the temple furnishings, why were the pillars at the north and the south entrances named, and what do the names Jachin and Boaz mean or represent?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I don't think I've been asked that before. So, just a little review. David wanted to build the temple. God says, no, I'm going to build you a house. Solomon, David's son, was able to build that temple. And in fact, God told David, I'm going to let your son do it. In Chronicles, David works really hard to set up his son, give him supplies and kind of everything he needs. And then, when the temple is constructed, it's kind of, I don't know, chapters 5, 6, and 7, and then kind of 8 is sort of the dedication. This is all 1 Kings. So this goes on for all. We get a lot of details. Some of you guys probably love that kind of stuff. It's like, ooh, details, and you could almost make a little model of what it looked like. And but when we're getting a little bit towards the end, there are these 2 massive pillars outside the temple. They're 26 feet high, which may not seem all that high, but they're 17 feet. Again, this is all in cubits, so I don't know if you work in cubits. We can kind of translate it a cubit was about as long as your elbow to the end of your finger. For most of us, it's about 18 inches, 20 inches, or something like that. But these pillars were 17 feet wide.
Wow.
That's pretty wide for a pillar. And they were hollow and bronze. So kind of shiny, cool. One of them was called Jachin, or he establishes. And the other one, Boaz, in him is strength. Now, interestingly, David's great-grandfather was named Boaz. That was the husband of Ruth.
Yeah.
If you read the book of Ruth, if you want to find out more about that, Boaz is a pretty good guy. Ruth is a pretty amazing woman. So let's just, I don't want to jump there yet. But now the text doesn't go into a lot of details as to why these 2 pillars are called Jachin and Boaz. But we can guess. And it's, I think the point here is when God's people are approaching the temple, and some of them were able to go in, drawing near to pray, they would be reminded that God has established his temple, his people, and strength is only found in him and him alone. So every time you see these massive pillars out of bronze, you're reminded God is the one who establishes his kingdom and his people, and only in him is found strength. So those are my thoughts. Interesting question. Yeah, that's probably about all I could say.
While we're on this one, though, and Mike, you can jump in if you have thoughts on this, but is there a reason why they were bronze? Is there any significance there that correlates with the meaning of the names that we should take into consideration, or not necessarily?
That's a really interesting question. I think most of us are kind of familiar with the Olympics, right? You've got gold, silver, and bronze, first, second, and third.
Yeah.
Well, it does kind of go back to the value of these metals, and when it comes to both the tabernacle and the temple, we see the closer you get to God and God's character and God's nature, the more valuable the materials are. So the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant, the cherubim that were on top of the mercy seat, all gold. And they kind of move out, and things are silver. And then as you kind of move out a little bit further, it's bronze. They're all valuable, but gold is, as it is today, more rare, more precious.
Mm-hmm.
Silver also rare, but not as rare or precious. And bronze, was easier to obtain. So again, I'm a little hesitant to kind of make up things that the text doesn't say, but it does seem clear that there's a prioritization, and this is on the outside of the temple. It would be bronze. I mean, you imagine kind of something bronze today. It would be cool and shiny and obviously valuable and enormous, but not. It's kind of further out from the things that are silver, and then the things that are kind of closer to the ark and kind of the center, the Holy of Holies, which tended to have more of the valuable metals and gold and things like that. So that's probably about all I could say about why it was bronze.
Yeah, that's good.
I was looking this up, and I unfortunately couldn't get to finding the actual paper that this scholar Peter Leinhart, in his commentary, he mentioned. Because I definitely I had never thought of this before, but he points out a paper that hints at the idea of the monumental pillars are a prominent Edenic symbol. And
say that again?
He continues saying that the Edenic symbol. So like they're a callback to Eden, apparently.
Yes, I've heard that before.
Stationed at the doorway, they resemble cherubim, guardians of the holy place, and like the temple itself, they contain garden motifs. There's pomegranates, there's figs, all these things like are symbolizing the faithfulness or the fruitfulness of Eden. I haven't gotten the chance to find the paper. It apparently was written by James B. Jordan, and the paper was written in 1988, and it's called Thoughts on Jachin and Boaz. And so if I could ever find that paper, I would love to share it. But that's what Peter Leinhart is contending, was that the bronze pillars are calling back to Eden somehow.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting concept, because the temple does seem to be this place that is hearkening back to that time of when God and man could actually be with each other.
I love, I mean, in general, if you can make a connection back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3 in the Old Testament, I say go for it. And I think Genesis 1, 2, and 3 are kind of formative, foundational for the Old Testament. I would say kind of an introduction to the Bible. The only caution I would give is, unless a connection is a little bit more obvious or maybe even explicit, I would just be tentative about saying something. And I think you've done a good job of kind of putting a little caveat in there, Mike, about that. So one of the things I like to tell my students is, when you're teaching the Bible, don't make things up.
Yeah, that's a good rule.
The corollary to that is, don't repeat things that other people have made up. And I'm not saying that's what we're doing. I'm just saying, when whenever we encounter a theory that's really maybe really fascinating, I just want to say, let's just acknowledge that we need to be a little speculative here. And that's the only thing I would say. But again, generally, connections back to Genesis 1 and 2 or the Garden of Eden are fantastic. And obviously these pillars are decorated with a lot of kind of creation things, pomegranates, etc., like that. Read 1 Kings 7 if you want to kind of get more of a description about that. But yeah, so when I'm making these connections that the text doesn't make explicit, let's just acknowledge that we're speculating a little bit here, lest we say something and someone else says, well, Dave Lamb said this, and I'm like, wait, I was being I'm not sure about that. So, but it is fascinating. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, that's good. All right, guys. Well, let's jump to a quick commercial break, and then we'll come back with 3 more questions on 1 Kings, and then we'll wrap up the episode. If you're not already reading with us, we'd love to have you start reading today. Every month in the Awakening Bible community, we read a book or several books of the Bible together. Readings are only 1 to 3 chapters a day, 5 days a week, with weekends reserved for catch-up or deeper study. And as you read, we know that you will likely encounter questions, but that's where we come in. Submit your questions at AWKNG.com, and we will do our best to get them answered for you right here on the Ask a Scholar podcast. Well, welcome back, everyone. Let's dive straight into our final 3 questions so we can get as much wisdom and details on these as we can. So, Dr. Lamb, this next question comes from 1 Kings chapter 18, and they said, has to do with when Elijah confronts Ahab. The question says, what is the significance of the contest happening on Mount Carmel, and why was this demonstration of God's power the thing that eventually ended the drought?
Yeah. Now, one of the highlights, perhaps, in the Book of Kings is the confrontation between the prophets of Baal and the prophets, Elijah, on Mount Carmel. Let me give a little background to the people that are maybe a little less familiar with this story. So, this is taking place in the northern kingdom of Israel. So this is during the divided monarchy. King Ahab and Queen Jezebel are basically killing the prophets of Yahweh and worshiping kind of foreign gods. Jezebel was from the north, from Tyre, and into this the prophet Elijah, who just comes out of nowhere. We don't get anything about him at all. Just says there's going to be a drought, 3 years. Now during this time, he ends up. It's just kind of crazy stuff. Elijah ends up getting fed by ravens, and ravens, unclean animals. So I don't know what's going on there. And then he gets fed by a foreign widow. But we finally move to the point where he comes back. He's been gone for a while. Ahab's been, wanting to kill him because he's mad, because this is the guy that started the problem. And he confronts Ahab, and he suggests, let's have a challenge, a contest between Yahweh, whom I worship, and the prophets of Baal, and Baal. And so he's like, Ahab says, sounds like a great idea. So they set it up, and it's Ahab lets them go first. So they get to receive the kickoff. To use a football analogy, Ahab, Elijah says, you guys go first. Okay, we'll let the prophets of Baal go first. Elijah goes second. Okay, and it's just a funny story. While the prophets of Baal are doing their thing, whoever's God brings down fire on their altar, that's the God that's real. That's right. Kind of the way the contest is framed. The prophets of Baal are kind of doing their thing, and nothing's happening. Their soul altar is just kind of sitting there, nothing's happening. And so Elijah starts taunting them. It's like, hey, maybe where's Baal? What's he doing? Is he busy? Maybe he's kind of relieving himself over here. He uses words that we don't even know what they mean. And so people kind of think, well, gosh, it may be a little bit like, junior high boy humor or something here. He's taunting them totally. And nothing happens. Finally, Elijah says, okay, now it's my turn. Now it's 3 years of drought. Water's a a scarce commodity. He takes precious water, dumps it over his altar to make it even harder, as if it matters to God if it's harder. And then he prays. He says, that Israel may know that Yahweh is their God and I'm his prophet. He prays this, God, make it happen. And sudden, wham, this, I don't know, thunder, lightning, Elijah's altar is like torched, and it says the water was licked up, thorough, and then it's all about the Elijah remained faithful to Yahweh, and he prayed, and he was so confident he was willing to trash talk those prophets of Baal about the foolishness, and this was all public. So this was like the Super Bowl or whatever, what World Cup. I don't know what sporting event you're into these days, but this was a big deal, and the people realized Yahweh alone is God. It's not Baal, despite the fact that their king and their queen were worshiping Baal. This was a dramatic event. I put it up there in terms of the parting of the Red Sea, or maybe other events in the Old Testament, the conquest, the contest on Mount Carmel, Yahweh's utter humiliation of Baal, and the prophets of Baal revealed Yahweh alone is God, and worshiping Baal is just utter foolishness. It was a big event. Why did this demonstration end the drought? Well, go back to Genesis. To 1 Kings 17. The text, Elijah basically says it's going to be 3 years for years. Okay, so it's hard to know. I think in James is where we find out it was actually kind of 3 years, kind of precisely. But God said that there was going to be a drought of several years, and at the end, after his display of power over the prophets of Baal, Elijah's out there looking like, and he's talking to a servant. It's like, oh, what's happening? Oh, there's little clouds out there. Oh, the clouds are getting closer. And he's like, okay, we need to run back because it's going to start pouring. And then God has been holding back the rain, and he finally brings rain to his land. I don't know if any of you guys have ever been to Israel. It's an arid place, and the Jordan River is the source of water, but they desperately relied on rain, and they were desperately on God to provide their rain. And so it's a display of God's power, God's sovereignty. He alone is God, and Elijah was his prophet. Elijah remained faithful to him, and Elijah knew the power of prayer. So those are some of the big themes I see in this really important story.
That's good.
I do think that a part of also the significance, Dr. Lamb, when I think about it, is like everything, it was stacked against Yahweh, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Where like it's one prophet versus 600. It's two altars, but now one is completely soaked. Elijah does not do any show and dance. He has no like extravagant like procedure. He doesn't do anything fancy, and he even asks the people the question, will you choose this day who you're going to worship? And even the people don't even give an answer of that they're going to agree to these terms. They're just quiet. And it's like everything is stacked against Yahweh. And then just from a simple prayer, him closing his eyes, and fire comes down, and the altar is completely consumed with all the water, and everyone then finally reacts. I mean, I think the significance of just like how, if you're listening to the story for the first time, you have absolutely no idea what's going to happen. Like you don't know how this will resolve. Is Elijah going to die in this? Is Yahweh going to do something that's so convincing that no one on that mountaintop would have a shadow of a doubt that Yahweh is truly the God to worship? Um, and so I find the significance is just simply, wow, everything is stacked against Yahweh, but none of those can actually overcome his power or his might. And so it is a hilarious story when we look back at it. But I mean, just the dramatic effect of how everything is set up, you're supposed to be left with, yeah, there is no better God than Yahweh. Like, Baal sucks. Like, who worship this guy?
I love that. I love that. And it's kind of, he's by himself. You know, he gives them home field advantage. He gives them everything that and it doesn't matter. Because when you're on when you're on the side of Yahweh, you're going to win. The other thing that I saw this as I was working on my commentary was just how closely God worked to kind of almost disciple the people to do little acts of obedience along the way. He gets people and he calls them, he tells them to come closer. They come closer in verse 30, chapter 18. He repairs the altar and then he asks for help. And you know, he gets help. He says, fill the jars with water. Now, again, this is during a drought. And he's telling people to fill these jars with water, and they do it. And he says, do it again. And he says, do it a third time. And he, along the way, he is kind of giving people opportunities to be faithful in some small ways. And this is the problem. These people have been disobedient in big ways, but he's kind of bringing them in and almost kind of discipling them, and they obey. And that does eventually lead to the people saying, Yahweh indeed is God. That's his verse 39. But the kind of the discipling of the people by Elijah gives them little opportunities to do small steps of faithfulness, to move them back towards God. And I just think, how can we be thinking about doing that in our ministries, giving people, even people that have fallen in some ways or moved away from God, let's give them some small acts of obedience they can do to kind of maybe lead up to bigger things. But it's a great story. I love it.
Yeah, I love that point. That's great. Really good. I like that practical takeaway too. It kind of reminded me of when Jesus turns water into wine and he's given everybody little tasks to do, and his mom's there saying, do whatever he says to do, and let's see what he can do in return. Okay, let's jump over to let's see, 1 Kings 19. This is where this question derives from. They said, when the Lord speaks to Elijah in 1 Kings 19, and the scriptures say in verse 11 that the Lord passed by, was that in literal form or spirit form? And what was the purpose of the wind, earthquake, and fire all happening before the whisper came?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Again, this is one of my favorite stories. Maybe a little bit less familiar, but again, we've just talked about Elijah and Mount Carmel. Jezebel was not excited about having all her prophets get kind of taken out, and so she puts out a hit on Elijah. He's like, if he is alive by this time tomorrow, it just kind of utters this curse on Elijah. He better be dead. And this is the guy that just defeated all these prophets of Baal, and all of a sudden, he's just panicking, and he runs. He runs away. He flees off to the wilderness, and it's almost like he kind of hides out under this broom tree, and he spirals into this suicidal depression. He basically tells God, just kill me.
Yeah.
Go ahead and kill me. What's the point? And I love God comes along, kind of meets Elijah where he's at. And I compare God to kind of a good counselor here. He asks Elijah questions, And even Elijah just asks Elijah the same question. Elijah kind of repeats himself a little bit according to the text. And he tells Elijah, you need to get a little exercise, you need to eat some food, and you need to sleep. It's like the sorts of things that you should do, self-care, basically. And they said, meet me at, Mount Horeb, which is another name for Mount Sinai. So, and he sends his angel and he kind of cares for him. And so he shows up at Horeb, and it says, Yahweh passed him by. So was that literal form or spirit form? I'm not really sure. The text makes it clear, though, that God somehow passed by him. And so I don't know exactly what that means. I think it was probably more than just kind of some sort of a spiritual thing, but it sounds very physical. And the text here is very physical in terms of what is being described. And it's literally kind of earth, wind, and fire. If you're familiar with the group, there's a breaking of wind, wind breaking rocks, not breaking of wind, wind breaking rocks. And then there's this earthquake, and then there's a fire. Now, interestingly, Moses experienced all of these back in Exodus. He saw the fire at the burning bush. There was the earthquake on top of the mountain, and then the wind was what that kind of parted the sea, the Red Sea, in Exodus chapter 14. So, and again, it's the same place. It's Mount Sinai that God revealed himself to Moses. So there's all sorts of connections between Elijah and Moses here. But it's interesting. It's like God is saying, connect to my power in creation. Fire, massive wind that's literally shattering rocks, and then an earthquake. And I've lived in California for a while, and if you've never experienced an earthquake, there's nothing quite as like destabilizing as the ground under your feet moving. But it's like God saying, I am the God. You don't need to worry about Jezebel. Okay. I am the God that sent that fire on that drenched altar. I am the God of creation. I create fire. I created the earth, and I can make it shake. I created the wind, and I can make it blow. But then, shockingly, God is not somehow in any of these things. One of the scholars I was reading talks about you could say that there are three non-theophanies. A theophany is an appearance of God, but in each case it says God is not in the wind, God is not in the fire, and God is not in the earthquake. So three non-theophanies, and then all of a sudden you have this whisper. And somehow there's a way that God is present in that whisper. And I don't know what that means, except, again, it's almost like, like a counselor. God is like showing him, I'm going to reveal my power to you in creation. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. I'm going to have you do some self-care here, Elijah. And then I'm going to just give you a soothe. It looks like So I'm not exactly sure what's going on, but it's a great story of God connecting with his prophet and revealing to him in the way that Elijah needed to be revealed to. And then Elijah, it works. God commissions him, go anoint a new king over Israel, anoint a new king over Aram, and anoint a new prophet, Elisha, and he goes and does it. It's God's tactic works here, and it's wonderful.
Let me pause this really quick. Santana, did it glitch on your side whenever he was responding? Because a chunk of what he said cut out for me.
It glitched.
It did. I mean, but
it did. Okay.
Picked it right back up. So I don't know how we.
Because I missed.
I don't know how we.
Well, it cut off for me whenever you were going through whenever you first started, like you started to say that, it was like God was showing himself through his creation, and then you were about to jump to the next thing, and that's when it started to glitch. So I don't know if you can pick up there with your thought, if you still remember
I can
the
do it
thought
again
you
if you
had.
want.
Not the
That
whole
would be
thing.
great,
do
because
that
I think
again?
that was
Where are we picking up at, Carla?
well, it's up to you. Do you want us to do the whole question again? What would be most helpful for you?
Actually, that's a
Or he can just,
Dr. Lamb question.
what'd you say?
It's up to you. I could do the whole thing. My answer is not a short one. Maybe I could try to be a little more concise this time, but
I think if you just pick, go ahead.
I think I know where it glitched, but
I think so too.
you know what?
Yeah.
I won't go all the way back to Mount Carmel and Jezebel putting hit, blah blah blah, and then I think it glitched before I talked about Moses, so I could start there.
I'm still here, guys. I'm just trying to move stuff around.
Okay.
Put a black mark.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say pick up there. That would make
I'll
the most
start
sense,
when he
unless,
talks about Moses.
okay, Santana,
Yeah, and
would it be helpful for you to
I'll
listen
do a
to the
little
playback
pause.
or no?
I'm sorry, you guys were on top of each other. Say that again.
Sorry, I was going to ask if it would be helpful for you if you listened to the playback and gave us a point, or do you want him to pick up where he was suggesting?
Where he was suggesting.
Okay. All right. Let's do that, Dr. Lamb.
All right. I'm going to come out on a 3 shot that way, because he was on a close up.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So everybody looking into camera. And Dr. Lamb, I have you look down, because I think you were kind of like, and then come up. Here we go in 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, so these 3 experiences, the earthquake, the wind, and the fire, were all things that actually Moses experienced in the book of Exodus. So Moses experienced God, fire at the burning bush, and then there was an earthquake kind of on Mount Sinai, and then the wind was the wind of God's Spirit that kind of parted the Red Sea. So in each of these things, and you see a lot of connections between Moses's life and Elijah's life. So there's all these points of connection. And it's almost like God is saying to Elijah here, I am the God of Moses. I am the God of your creation. I am the God that created the earth, that can creates the wind, that can make the earth shake, and can create fire. You don't need to worry about Jezebel.
Yeah.
And then in the midst of this, there's a way he's like connecting Elijah to creation, but on some level, God wasn't in any of these dramatic manifestations of his power. It's one of the scholars I read calls them 3 non-theophanies. A theophany is an appearance of God. So these are like 3 non-theophanies. He's not in the wind, he's not in the fire, he's not in the earthquake. But somehow God is present in this whisper, this still small voice. And again, it's like God is being a counselor here, using questions, helping his prophet connect to nature, and then now a silent whisper to soothe his troubled prophet. And then he gives them this call, anoint a new king over Aram, anoint a new king over Israel, and anoint a new king, anoint a new prophet in your place. And Elijah goes and does it. It's like it worked. It's just amazing interaction between Elijah and his God. After Elijah was going through a dark time, I sometimes teach counseling students, and I talk to them about like suicidal prophets. Jonah had an incident where he tells God to kill him too, and I think it helps people who are struggling on some level to realize that these godly people in the Bible had dark thoughts, and God was with them somehow, revealing his power and his character, and kind of acting like a good therapist with them. It's just an amazing picture of God's interactions with Elijah here.
Yeah, that's great.
I do appreciate just the callback to Moses, and back to what the questioner was asking. I mean, I would almost want to ask, sort of going back to that incident when Moses is on top of Sinai and he's in the cleft of the rock, and Yahweh passes by, that his goodness passes in front of Moses. I would almost wonder, like, well, would we consider that physical? Would we consider that spiritual? I don't know if we can actually qualify it as physical or like exclusively. If anything, there was a tangible experience of the Lord passing by, of Yahweh going by, and like this moment of this happening with Elijah, it was almost this reassurance of like, you are my prophet just as much as Moses was my prophet. And the fire, wind, and the earth, like all that is great. I love the callback to Moses, and just how the still small voice, or in sometimes the way the translation could be made is this thin voice. There's almost as though that you have now Elijah needing to pay attention. He has to strain, he has to lean in, he has to bring his ear closer to where the sound is coming from, because I'm not blasting this on a megaphone. I need you to come closer. I need you to lend your ear to me. And like, I love just that of, again, you are my prophet. We have a relationship. Come here. Listen to what I am trying to say to you, and pay attention. And so, yeah, if anything, this is a very kind and compassionate moment that God has with Elijah. Just the fact that he could have rightly just come back at Elijah of like, what's wrong with you? Like, why are you afraid of this woman? Why are you afraid of Jezebel? But he doesn't. He simply is like, I'm trying to draw you out. I'm trying to get you to answer my questions. I want you to engage with me. And so come here and listen to my voice. Focus on this voice. And so, yeah, it's a beautiful moment, and I appreciate the answer and just the callback again of like, yeah, Elijah, your relationship with me is just as much as intimate and as powerful as the relationship I had with Moses.
Yeah, it's interesting to me as you guys are talking. To me, that whisper, it feels very intimate. Like if you're going to whisper, you've got to be close to somebody. You know what I mean? And so when you think of it in that term, it's almost like God showed all these things to get his attention. Like you said, he got his mental health right. He was the counselor, and then it's like he got real intimate and real close, which I think in Elijah's, from his standpoint, would just be such a reassurance of, wow, God is literally with me. He's so close in this moment. And I think us as believers, many of us that have gone through really dark times, a lot of times you hear people when they come on the other side of that say, I never felt the Lord as close as I did when I was walking through whatever it was. And it just shows, I feel like, the nature and the love that God has for us, of how in those horrible, hard times, it's when he really just leans in as close as possible to give us exactly what we need.
That's good. That's good. No, that's fantastic. And yeah, I think that's really good. There are a variety of places. Psalm 23 speaks about God's word is my counselors. I'm sorry, not Psalm 23. Psalm 119. God's word is my counselor, and we see God with Jonah, with Moses, and here with Elijah. And I love that connection, Mike, to Exodus 34, when God's presence somehow passed by Moses, and that's where God revealed his name. Yahweh, Yahweh, God, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. This name revelation, which is just really important, declaration of who God is. And it's this amazingly wonderful, slow to anger and gracious God. So yeah, this is really good.
Yeah. Okay, guys. Well, let's jump to one final question and then we'll wrap up this episode. This question comes from 1 Kings 21. It says, do you feel the main lesson of 1 Kings 21 is around the consequences of unchecked power? And if so, what key takeaways would you say we should look out for and guard ourselves against? So maybe start by giving some context around what is happening in 1 Kings 21.
Yeah. So, some of you may be familiar with the story of Naboth's vineyard. So Naboth was Ahab's neighbor. And Ahab's just kind of sitting out one day. I don't know. He's taking a nap or something, and he's like, "Ooh, I really like that vineyard. I want that vineyard." It's a classic example of coveting.
Yeah.
The last of the 10 Commandments talks about coveting. He's like, I really want that vineyard. And he says, he kind of works with Naboth. He says, "Hey, you know what? I'll give you a fair price." And Naboth, maybe is a little foolish here. It's like, well, Ahab is the king. Maybe I should just give it to him. But he's like, "The Lord forbid I give you my ancestral inheritance." So he's not going to give up this land that, was his and his ancestors for a long time. So Ahab leaves this encounter. He's all kind of depressed. And Jezebel, Jezebel was an evil woman, but she made things happen. And she's like, "Wait a minute, aren't you king? Are kings different here in Israel than where I'm from?" But it's like, so he's like, "Okay, let me take care of it." So basically, Jezebel takes care of it by having Naboth killed. He's falsely accused of a crime, and he's killed. And then Ahab is just able to take possession of this property. And so, all is good until Yahweh sends his prophet Elijah and said, "Hey," and basically pronounces judgment. This is kind of later on in chapter 21. And it's basically a curse condemning Ahab and Jezebel's family, and their dynasty. It's pretty, the dogs will eat Jezebel within the bounds, bounds of Jezreel, and anyone who belongs to Ahab shall die in the city. The dogs will eat. It's a pretty gruesome pronouncement of judgment.
Yeah.
To Ahab's credit, it gets his attention, and he repents. And so God says, "Okay, I'm going to delay this to your sons." But yes, I think this is the consequences of unchecked power. And power corrupts, and ultimate power corrupts ultimately. And we see that, throughout the book of Kings. And I think, it's the danger of coveting. Um, you look at this, the end of the 10 Commandments, a lot of them are pretty terse. No, don't commit adultery, don't commit murder, don't false witness, all these really kind of terse ones. And the coveting one goes into a lot of detail. And it's clear that God, what is behind coveting is not trusting God for your possessions, that for him to provide for you, and kind of making an idol of materialism. And, whether we're coveting our neighbor's car or our neighbor's spouse or our neighbor's yard or our neighbor's garden, I don't know what it is. This is what marketing does. It shows us, the ads on our TV, they show us what, rich, successful, beautiful people have, and it makes us want to covet. And against this, God's word says, don't covet. Be content in me. What's behind coveting is kind of an idolatry of materialism. And so I just think that what we need to say is, we remind ourselves that God has given us what we need. We have everything that we need. Don't lay up treasures on earth, is how Jesus would put it. You can't take these treasures with you when you go. Jesus says to the rich young ruler, lay up treasures in heaven. Give your money, give your money to the poor. It's this crazy statement. And I think that, but ultimately, looking to money, possessions, the idols of this world will not lead us to fulfillment and contentment. It's God and God alone. And so those are the things that I see coming out of the story of Naboth's vineyard and Ahab's, coveting.
Yeah, that's good.
Instantly, whenever I think about this story with Ahab, it's projecting, but I immediately do think of the story of Macbeth. and, and just how like there's these similarities. You have a king who is, well, a guy who wants to be king, but he doesn't know how to get it, and his wife ultimately helps him get it by essentially murder. And here there's this it's not about the kingship. He is the king, but
Yeah.
he wants just a piece of land. And it just seems to be that that what at the core of what the story is we're seeing already, and we talked about it earlier, of how the northern kings, they were just on this descent. They never worshipped or were allegiant to Yahweh consistently. And it just was like this is like the final straw. It's like, is Ahab going to be at least an okay guy? And and instead he violates one of the most like basic and core tenets of what Israel was founded as, that the tribes and the clans and the families would be given this ancestral land because this was the way that God would take care of the people of Israel. And so for Ahab to violate such a basic premise of, this is my ancestral land, this is the land that was given to me by Moses and by Joshua, by when we all came into this land together, and now you're requesting that I give this up. And so it's in many ways I can imagine just the outrageousness, and in some sense almost this moment of, okay, let's clarify very well for the audience. Ahab's a terrible person. And we're going to just make sure he had kind of a brief okay moment after Mount Carmel, but we're going to make it very clear that there is no turning back. Like, he has crossed the line that no one will be able to just forget, that this is so basic amongst the people. How dare you?
Yeah.
And so anyhow, it's like the punishment, I agree, it's gruesome, especially from a Western modern lens. We're just completely horrified by the idea. But it almost seems like fitting to what Ahab had essentially done. He's cut off Naboth's family for the future, like their livelihood, everything that's connected to what they were supposed to depend upon from God, the land, has now been just stolen away from them. And so, anyhow, it's a thing. I like it doesn't seem as important to us, I think, as moderns, but I always kind of now keep in mind, this is a people who depended upon this land because this was how God was going to care and love them. And to all of a sudden take that most basic thing away from a family. How is this if he has relatives, like, how are they now going to take care of themselves without this land anymore? Because now the king took it, and now everyone is fearing, if the king can take this guy's land, does that not mean he can take our land too? That all of a sudden everything that was the foundation of their society has just been toppled over because of this one act.
Yeah. And we see Ahab, basically in the next chapter dies in battle, just as the prophet Micaiah prophesies. And it's a pretty gruesome story, and I read 1 Kings 22. It's a great story, but it's kind of the wages of sin or death, and we see that pretty clearly with King Ahab.
Well, thank you both for all of your wisdom when it comes to these questions that we covered on First Kings. And Dr. Lamb, we're excited to have you back for a second episode to hit Second Kings, because we've got another group of questions there. But before we sign off on this one, do you have any of the resources that you have written that you could share with the students one last time?
Certainly. Yeah. So my commentary on the Book of Kings. Let's see if I can get the angle right. Story of God commentary from Zonder, and that came out a couple of years ago. I loved working on that, and it's not a really intense academic commentary. There's, some of you guys, if you're familiar with some of the series that are a little bit more academic, and there's a lot of kind of practical stuff. We engage with ancient Near Eastern sources, and so that would probably be a great place for people that are interested in the Book of Kings. The book that I wrote that is sold the best is God Behaving Badly is the God of the Old Testament, Angry, Sexist, and Racist. Let's see if I can get it right. Yeah, and that just talks about, troubling places in the Bible, trying to make sense of, God's behavior that doesn't make a lot of sense. So, yeah, in fact, I was speaking on some of that last night at an InterVarsity group. But yeah, those are two of the resources that I'd probably highlight, and hopefully people can check those out, or check out my website, davidtlamb.com.
Okay, great. Yeah, I love the concept of that God Behaving Badly book, because Mike knows the last several podcasts that we've done, we've had to hit some really hard stories that make you question things, why things happen certain ways and why God responded in certain ways or didn't respond in a specific way. So I'm glad you wrote a resource on that. I think a lot of people battle with that and struggle with trying to understand. And so thank you for taking the time to write that resource.
Sure.
Okay, so let's leave you with one fun question. We like to end on a fun question. Tell us your favorite thing to eat. If you could eat anything, what would it be?
Wow. It's hard to go wrong with pepperoni pizza. I love ice cream. As I've moved into my, I guess this is my 7th decade. I eat less of both of those, but ice cream might be my favorite, and mint chip, or I eat Klondike bars now because it limits my portion size. Back in the day when I was scooping a bowl of ice cream, I just keep going. But a Klondike bar is a limited amount, so I have one of those most days after dinner. But thank you. I love ice cream.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I haven't had a Klondike bar in a long time. I'm going to have to get some of those. That actually sounds pretty good. Well, thank you so much for being with us. This was a great episode, and we look forward to having you back with us again soon. All those that are listening, please make sure that you like, subscribe, share, all of those things that helps get our podcast out to more people. And we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode as we cover 2 Kings. If you're enjoying the Ask a Scholar podcast, click follow on your podcast listening app to subscribe. Want to help further our mission? Consider becoming a monthly partner at AWKNG.com and help us make an impact in the lives of others all around the world as we work to make biblical understanding accessible to all with no exceptions. Join us next time as we get more of your Bible questions answered. And don't forget to visit AWKNG.com to engage in all our biblical resources that we offer.